This program is made possible in part by the Maryland and Howard County Arts Councils.
Welcome to The Writing Life. My name is Ethelbert Miller, and my guest today is David Mura. David Mura is a poet, creative nonfiction writer, critic, playwright, and performance artist. Some of his titles are Angels for the Burning, Turning Japanese, The Colors of Desire, and a new novel, Famous Suicides of the Japanese Empire. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
You know, when I read your poetry, I seem to keep coming back to this word, desire. What is it about this word that embraces your work? I know you once wrote that desire must be hot, promise is cold. You've also written about the internment of desire. So talk about that word.
Well, one of the ways I look at it is that if race is a taboo subject in American society, which I think it still is, and people don't like to talk about it, then if you mix race and sexuality together, people really don't want to talk about it. And for me, growing up as an Asian American male, the whole issue of race and sexuality was something which was very important to me. When I was growing up, the figures of Asian and Asian American males that I saw on the screen or TV were caricatures. They were stereotypes like Hop Sing in Bonanza, Long Duk Dong and 16 Candles, geeky, desexualized Asian males. Conversely, the images of Asian women and Asian American women often conform to the stereotype of what we call Susie Wong, or the comfort woman, or the geisha, the prostitute in Miss Saigon, where the women were seen as highly sexualized, exotic, and subservient to the white males that they encountered. So, and then when I looked at my own family history in relationship to these issues, I began to understand that there was a connection between, say, the history of Japanese Americans and their internment in the camps and certain issues about sexuality. And that became the issue that I wanted to explore.
And how does it come back to desire, though?
Well, first of all, it is who I desire, both who I want to be and who I end up desiring sexually. And I grew up in a mainly white Jewish suburb. And I think, like a lot of kids of color who grow up in a place where there aren't a lot of other people of color, there's a tendency to want to blend in, and oftentimes a tendency to internalize the racial hierarchy of the society. So that when I was a kid growing up, I thought, when a white friend would say to me, "I think of you, David, just like a white person," I would go, "That's really great. That's what I want to be." And then I would also think about how, who I desired sexually. I mean, there were only white girls around, but I saw that was who I wanted to date. And it wasn't until I read Frantz Fanon, and this was very, I was like in my late 20s when I finally came upon Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask. And in that he talks about the black school child in the French West Indies colonial school system. And he talks about how the black school child there, West Indian school child, reads about our ancestors, the Gauls, and how the great white hunters went into Africa to civilize the savages. And Fanon says, what is that black West Indian school child learning? He or she is learning self-alienation, self-hatred, and identification with their colonial oppressor. And I went, oh,
Right.
That's what I've been doing.
Right.
And then Fanon also talks about, in Black Skin, White Mask, he talks about a black man who constantly sleeps with white women. And he says that this black man has this illusion that his feelings of inferiority will be removed by sleeping with white women.
Right.
And I went, oh, that's what I've been doing.
Right. You know, when I look at most of your books, family is very important to you. Many of your books are dedicated to your wife, your children. But I know especially that your grandfather and your father, their lives shape your own. Talk about these two men briefly.
Well, Japanese-American history can be divided by generation, and in part that's because after the early 1920s, because of anti-Asian immigration laws, there was no immigration of Japanese. So the first generation came between about 1890 and 1920, and that's my grandfather's generation, my grandparents' generation. And then the children of those were called, and that was the Issei generation, first generation. Second generation was my father's generation, my mother's generation, it's called Nisei. Now both those generations were interned in the internment camps during World War II. But the internment camps presented them with different dilemmas. The internment camps said to Japanese Americans, we as America are associating you with the enemy. We believe you're spies and dangerous to America. Even though when my parents were in the internment camps, they were teenagers. My mom was 12 years old. But when my families got out of the internment camps, my parents wanted to assimilate into American society. My father talks about how a teacher in the camp, a white teacher said to him, one day you'll get out of these camps, but for your sake, you should try and be not 100% American, but 200% American.
Let's look at your grandfather, your father, and yourself, and then I want you to read this poem, Relocation. But look at these men in terms of the issue that you talked about earlier, sexuality. How are these individuals different from yourself?
Okay. This is Relocations, and this is a poem for grandfather Mura, who's my grandfather. And my grandfather came here about 1903. He owned a nursery. He was interned during World War II, and then he returned to Tokyo, to Japan to live, and he wrote haiku all his life. Relocations for grandfather Mura. People married by pictures then. When they lied, the bride stepped from the ship and found a dwarf, nose gnarled as a ginger root. He was so handsome he came in person, held her as America rose and fell ahead. Gulls shrieked. On the dock, the pale ghosts gathered. He bought a greenhouse on a field hand's wages, and with Cuban cigar jammed in his jaw, watched his orchids like petulant courtesans. Nights the eucalyptus swayed. His eyes gleamed with his Packard's chrome beneath the moon. He slapped his thighs, rubbed the dirt from his hands, prayed for dice-clicking sevens. By dawn he was whistling home. He stumbled in roses, said hello to the thorns. When they shipped them like cattle to the camps, he sat in the mess hall and creased a napkin like the 9-ply folds of heaven. Out of his hands flew a slim white crane. His wife shook her head, smiled, forgot barbed wire, guards. At a mule-pulled plow, he wiped his baseball cap across his brow, looked past the wires to the prairie where the west begins. Tipping his cap to the corporal in the tower, he muttered, "Baka," picked up the reins. He named his son Katsuji, Prince of Birds. After the war, it was Tom, such a strange name, like someone beating a drum, hollow, a hard echo. He laughed at the boy's starving Jesus, nails piercing the little bones of the hands and feet, told him the Buddha always ate well. When she died, he returned to Tokyo. Still attached to his body, limbs folded on a chair, he spent his evenings composing haiku. Bonsai tree, like me, you are useless and a little sad. Now, at the beginning of that poem, I allude to the fact that many of the Japanese Americans of my grandparents' generation had arranged marriages. And oftentimes they were also picture brides, where they would send their picture back to Japan. And sometimes people lied about the pictures. But my grandfather was very handsome, so he sent his own picture, and he didn't have to send his picture. He went back in person. And so that was the marriage of my grandparents. Now, when my parents got together, this was after the war. My dad and my mother were living in Chicago. And my dad saw my mother at this dance for Nisei, for second-generation Japanese Americans. And he looked across the gym and he said to his friend Mas, "That's the girl I'm going to marry." When I was growing up, I grew up in a Jewish suburb. The girls that I tried to date were Jewish. Oftentimes, they might go out with me on a date or two, and then they'd discover, their parents would discover that I wasn't Jewish. And so they would say, "I can't go out with you anymore." And I think a big difference between myself and my father or my grandfather was that the whole question of interracial dating was not something that they faced. In fact, you know, for my father's generation, it was still the time of miscegenation laws where you couldn't marry across race.
Let me ask you this. When you draw upon writing about your family, do you draw upon just simply the stories that you hear, or do you also do a lot of research?
I do a fair amount of research, and because my parents, for instance, never talked about the internment camps to me, and they didn't really talk much about the past. That was something they wanted to forget. And I remember reading Maxine Ong Kingston, the great Chinese-American writer, wrote 2 memoirs, one about her mother and one about her father. And in the one about her father, she says, you know, "Father, you won't tell me the stories," unlike her mother. She says, "So I'll have to make them up." And so in certain ways, I've had to imagine the lives of my parents because they don't really talk about the past. And in order to do that, I had to do a lot of research, both in history and in oral histories and other documents.
You seem to also have a fascination with photography, and I know in the poem, The Color of Desire, is influenced by a 1930 picture of a lynching. But there also, I saw, in terms, even cover some of your books, pictures from the internment. How do you work in terms of looking at pictures and now interpreting those things for something for the printed page?
Well, interpreting, say in the poem The Colors of Desire, where I take a photograph of a lynching, which is a part of American history that we don't want to remember and don't want to deal with. But then I ask myself, looking at the picture, what is my position in relationship to the picture as a Japanese American, as somebody who's neither black nor white? And in the poem, what I end up doing is imagining my father during World War II. And what happened is he was interned in the South, in an internment camp in Jerome, Arkansas. And in the poem, he gets out, occasionally they would get allowed on a day-long pass, like prisoners allowed to get out for a day, and they had to come back. And he would get on a segregated bus. And it was interesting, because I asked my dad, "Where'd you sit?" And he said, "Well, the whites wanted us to sit in the front of the bus." So we sat in the front of the bus. He sat, you know, and that's the way that, you know, in a way he became an honorary white. I always say that there's 2 caveats to that. One is you can sit here in the front of the bus, but remember, you'll never be able to drive the bus. Mm-hmm. And secondly, you must claim no relationship to the people at the back of the bus. You must pay no attention to what's happening to the people at the back of the bus. And you must absolutely never, ever protest what's happening to the people at the back of the bus. And if you do all that, then we'll let you be an honorary white person. And I don't think my father understood that bargain, that he just sat where his life was going to be easiest. And I don't think that then to think about what that meant in terms of lynchings, which are all about rage against miscegenation, against sexuality across the races, because he didn't really have to think about that. Whereas that was something that I very much
Well, what
thought
happens
about.
in terms of when you think about it, but you're looking as a writer, you're looking at photographs.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at how you, as a writer, look at a photograph different from somebody else? Because you're going to do something with these pictures, with these images.
I think I'm thinking about the stories behind the photographs, or I'm thinking about, again, like I said, how do I particularly view this photograph? And how is my viewpoint different from other people because I'm Japanese American? And and I understand that there's almost a mainstream, usually white way of looking at the photograph, and then there's my own. It goes back to Du Bois and the double racial consciousness, that sort of thing. And I'm trying to explore that. How do I feel about the photograph?
Right. 1984 is not just a novel by Orwell, it's also a major turning point in your life. In 1984, you actually went to Japan. Talk about that experience, which leads into the memoir, Turning Japanese.
I go there in certain, maybe I should read, this is the beginning of the memoir about my going to Japan. I am a Sansei, a third-generation Japanese American. In 1984, through luck and through some skills as a poet, I traveled to Japan. My reasons for going were not very clear. At the time, I'd been working as an arts administrator in the Writers in the Schools program, sending other writers to grade schools and high schools throughout Minnesota. It wasn't taxing, but it didn't provide the long stretches needed to plunge into my own work. I'd applied for U.S.-Japanese Creative Artists Exchange Fellowship mainly because I wanted time to write. Japan, that was where my grandparents came from. It didn't have much to do with my present life. But then Japan had never seemed that important to me even in childhood. On holidays, when we'd get together, I didn't notice that the faces around me looked different from most of the faces at school. I didn't notice that my grandfathers had returned to Japan after my grandmothers died. No one spoke about them, just as no one spoke about Japan. We were American. It was the 4th of July, Labor Day, Christmas. All I noticed was that the food we were eating, futomake, masegohan, teriyaki, kamaboko, was different from what I liked best. McDonald's, pizza, hot dogs, tuna fish salad. Now, I grew up very much as a child of America, imbibing American culture, wanting to think of myself as American, not wanting to think of myself as a Japanese American or what that meant. But when I went to Japan, I was forced to confront all these issues about what it meant to be Japanese American in ways that I hadn't before. And I had to think about my own family's history, and I also had to think about just the simple fact that when I got off the plane at Narita and everybody looked like me, it felt different. And there was something I really liked about that I had never experienced before in America. And I had to ask myself, what did that mean? So my trip to Japan, in a way, was an investigation to try to find the language to write and explain who I am and who my family is.
Talking about language, you once wrote, if you are a writer of color in America, you often grow up feeling that your right to the language is constantly being challenged. You don't quite have the same claim that a white person possesses. Do you still agree with that statement?
Yeah, I still agree with it. It's, first of all, people constantly still, the image of Asian Americans is still oftentimes as perpetual foreigners. My family's been here for 100 years. People still ask me, where are you from? When I say Chicago, they go, no, really, where are you from? And it's ironic, and they may also say, well, you speak English so well, and yet, I'm a writer. Beyond that, if you look at the tradition, especially the tradition that I was taught, where I was not exposed to many writers of color at all during my education, you don't see writers who, come from your background, look like you, write about the issues and things that you're writing about.
How would you compare Lawson Anada's work, like before the war, to your own work?
First of all, Lawson actually was in the camps. He's a bit older than I am. And he comes from a slightly older generation. I think that Lawson was a jazz musician, so his influence is
you play piano, don't you?
Very much, yeah, I play piano, but his was very much through jazz, and I think also through an oral tradition. I think that I grew up in an environment which was less heavily Japanese American than he did. I grew up in a time of the really more like the 60s and 70s. And my experience of the camps was not something that's direct. It was trying to imagine these things. And finally, I think that the issue of sexuality and assimilation is much more at the center of my work than his is. Partly because I think he grew up in a more predominantly Japanese American community.
You talk about going back to Japan. I know that along with writers like Frantz Fanon, another writer that influenced you was Aimé Césaire. Talk about that connection. I mean, the whole thing of return to my native land, and maybe you going to Japan. I mean, how do you work out the whole thing of home?
Yes, well, I think Césaire was a very important writer to me because he was dealing with the whole idea that you were educated in a culture and in a school system where your own history is left out, and that you have to create that history, you have to create that culture, and beyond that, that Césaire is releasing in his writings anger about the fact of colonialization, about the fact of race. And for me, he gave me permission to express an anger about race that I had been repressing, that I had been afraid of. And it was giving me permission to express that.
In Song for Uncle Tom, Tonto, and Mr. Moto, you mentioned that, quote, the commercial world may in certain ways be less racist than the world of academia or the literary powers within the poetry world. What role does race today play in the shaping of our literary world? And are writers of color still powerless?
I think writers of color are increasingly read, but the issue of obtaining power is different. In other words, you have writers of color teaching in the academies, but are they in positions of power? Or are they, usually, if you're a writer of color, you're like one person, you're the one writer of color on the staff. You're the token person on the staff. You're lucky if you have another writer of color on the staff. But you don't really control what goes on in the department. You don't really control the curriculum. On the other hand, if you go out and find, if you write well, and you can find an audience. You have writers like, from Toni Morrison, Edwidge Danticat, Junot Diaz, Maxine Hong Kingston, who have found, a very large readership for their work. But within the academy or within institutions, they don't necessarily have a power commensurate with the readership.
How do you find at this time when the memoir is very popular, has your book received like a new audience?
I think that my book, especially like Turning Japanese, keeps being taught because it's about going to Japan and asking questions about my identity. But I've been told by Korean Americans who go to Korea that it's similar to, I've been told by Mexican Americans who've gone back to Mexico, who grew up here and hadn't been to Mexico, that my book speaks to them.
We look around at the changing books, the bookstore shelves. We see more writers of Philippines, Korean Americans. Do people now look at you as an elder?
Yes, they do. And it's very nice because I started an Asian American arts organization in Twin Cities. When I started, there were very few Asian American artists there. And I've seen a whole generation of young artists who I first knew in their 20s, now coming into their 30s and publishing books and winning awards and grants and establishing themselves as artists. And that's very rewarding to see that happening. Sometimes I feel a bit lonely because there's not very many artists of color my age. And there's certainly, in terms of Asian Americans, there's not a lot. I spend a lot of time talking to my friend whom you know, Alex Pate, who's an African American novelist, and we both sort of function sometimes as sort of the elders of the community.
Now you guys have been in, you and Alice have been in Minneapolis for some time, and you have a poem, Minneapolis Public. Does that poem sort of describe the future culture of America?
I think it absolutely does. People think of Minnesota as a very white place. Chris Rock says, you know, Minneapolis, the only two black people there are Prince and Kirby Puckett. But actually, 80% of the students in the Minneapolis school system are students of color. And in the first line of my poem, Minneapolis Public, goes, there are 150 first languages in our schools. And so the poem is really about what America is becoming. And there, you know, in the poem I list, there are people from Somalia, there are people from Mexico, there are people from Bosnia, there are people from Tibet, all around the globe, and these kids are growing up together. And that's the vision of America in a way that I feel like my work is speaking to.
Talking about your work, you have a new novel, Famous Suicides of the Japanese Empire. What is that book about?
During World War II, the Japanese Americans were asked to sign a loyalty oath. Now, some of them signed because they felt like they had no other choice. Some of them signed because they felt very patriotic and wanted to prove that the internment camps were wrong, that they were really loyal Americans. A small number felt loyal to America, but that their civil rights were being violated, and they protested. And they signed these two questions, no, no. And they were called no-no boys. After the war, these protesters were, in certain ways, looked at as traitors and ostracized from the Japanese American community. So my novel is about a son of one of these no-no boys. And he grows up in Chicago during the same time that I was growing up and he's dealing with this legacy which he doesn't understand and his parents don't talk about.
Let's close with an excerpt from your book, Where the Body Meets Memory.
This is about my birth, and my dad was in the service then, so I was born in a naval hospital. I was born on a sweltering summer day in June 1952. Early that morning, 2 white MPs drove my mother the 50 miles from the south side of Chicago to the Great Lakes Naval Training Center Hospital. My father was half a world away, stationed in Germany. Of course, he didn't want to miss the birth of his son. He didn't see me until I was 6 years old. But better to be in Germany than Korea, that terrible forgotten Asian war. When I think of my mother taking that drive to Great Lakes, it seems strange and poignant. She was just 20, still a girl, really. 8 years earlier, she'd been living in a concentration camp in the mountains of Idaho. And here she was driving an hour and a half with 2 white men she'd never seen before, even as her contractions sharpened and quickened. And I pushed harder to enter this world.
And we're very happy that you're here, David Mura. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you very much.